Here to discuss with an update on the whole European cannabis scene, the chief economist, I can't even pronounce it anymore. I shouldn't have had that hash. The chief economist, I don't know which language I'm speaking right now. El jefe del económico. From Whitney Economics. Let's hear it for Beau Whitney.
Buenos dias, motherfuckers. I'm an economist. I need something. Well, it's a pleasure to be back in Barcelona. It really is, and I want to extend my appreciation to ICBC for committing to me all these years now. It's been a great partnership. And so today I'm going to talk a little bit about what's going on in Europe. I recently spoke in The Hague, and I did a compare and contrast between the US and Europe, and I thought it really resonated, and so I thought that I would do a similar presentation, not in as much detail because there's other stuff to go over, but so thanks a lot for attending today. Let's see here. Hello. So today I'm going to talk about what's going on in globally, break it down by into European, then the U.S. This one? Okay. There's always some technical glitch. And then I'm going to look a little bit at the Spanish market as well. Okay, we're good. So I'm Beau Whitney. I'm the chief economist, easy for me to say, at Whitney Economics, and we do research and consulting and the like on the cannabis market. We look at cannabis, we look at hemp, we also look at the blockchain. We just added on that capabilities. And we're based out of Portland, Oregon. So yeah, we'll just take a look at this. Now, I first presented this slide in front of some members of the Irish Parliament, and it's good to get kind of grounded. I know it's a little bit of a review for folks in the audience, but there's really three industries in the cannabis industries. There's medical, there's adult use, and industrial. And then industrial is broken down into three markets as well, the fiber and the grain and the cannabinoid market. A lot of the conversation today has been about the cannabinoid market, but there's a lot of potential on the industrial side of cannabis. And countries are looking at this for economic development, economic growth, investment opportunities and the like. But there was a mention of a $1 trillion market earlier, and I've actually got the data to prove that it's a $1 trillion market. And a lot of the countries around the globe are waiting for the US to set the pace for the reform. But the US is just dragging its feet, so dysfunctional that there's a possibility of leadership, say in Europe, to displace the United States as the leader in global cannabis reform. And so I want to talk a little bit about hemp, and then I'll launch into the adult use and medical side. This is a chart that I borrowed from some folks, but I think it summarizes the potential of the cannabis plant from an industrial hemp perspective. There's all sorts of applications, from aeronautic to construction to paper to lubricants. You can even make EV batteries out of industrial hemp fiber. And I did a comparison of just 10 different market segments where hemp could have application, a substitute application. And just looking at minor market share, takeover by hemp away from traditional industry, supply, it's a $500 billion market just in those 10. And then by comparison, that's a conservative estimate of the global medical and adult use market. And you can see that it doesn't really compare. It's about twice as large, the industrial side is, over the medical side, or the medical and adult use side. And Europe's kind of taking the lead on industrial hemp, despite the fact that there's not a whole lot of acreage, but they're much more sophisticated. It's, France is a hub for this. Ukraine is doing a good job with industrial hemp. Poland is setting up these research think tanks that are doing some tremendous work in advancing the industrial side of cannabis. And there's about 115 countries that have some form of legal access, be it CBD, adult use, medical, and that number has increased over the years, and now it's shifting from, say, medical to adult use, and so some of the countries are starting to convert over. But when you add in the $250 billion of adult use and medical conservative, and then $500 billion on the industrial side, you can see that it adds up very quickly. And so this is we try to triangulate our forecasts, and so the low end of this forecast on a global basis, the global potential demand, that's illicit and legal combined, it's about 223 million euros. But that's based upon these surveys that are conducted kind of irregularly by the UN. When we adjust ours up a little bit for regional bias and the like, then the numbers start adding up quite quickly. And the EU's the second largest market in terms of revenue. It's not the largest market by any means in terms of total number of consumers. But the U.S. is by far the largest. The U.S. represents about $105 billion, not including hemp. But that I'm forecasting is going to go down. It's going to shrink due to price compressions because supply is in excess of demand in the United States, and there's a significant price compression occurring. And so, like I said, there's a shift over from CBD into medical into adult use. And in this chart, I really take a look at the potential of the market. So in terms of the TAM, illicit plus legal, the medical market has the greatest opportunity. So if they go adult use and then they start converting consumers over, there's this huge upside. So it's best to get your foot in the door in these medical countries, and then as they transition into adult use, then there's greater opportunity for growth. And then I did on the right side of that slide, I looked at the total addressable market in euros and dollars. And so Spain is right in there, but France and Germany and Italy are the large markets in this space. And a lot of that is due to the number of consumers. So last year, the U.S. sales topped $30 billion, it's 30.4. We had forecasted right around there. We were like 97% accurate. So our models are pretty good at predicting where the market's going to go in the U.S. And a lot of this new growth that's going to occur between now and, say, 2030 is coming from the new markets that have just legalized, and then the emerging markets that have been around for a couple of years but are still converting consumers away from the illicit market and into the legal market. And so next year, or this year, we're looking at growth of about 13% year over year to $34.6 billion. And like I said, this doesn't consider any federal reform. I doubt that federal reform will occur in the United States, unfortunately. And I'm not looking at the hemp-derived cannabinoids as well. I did do an analysis of the hemp-derived cannabinoids, intoxicating and non-intoxicating. It's about a $28-29 billion market just in the USA alone. And so you look at this potential, there's growth, there's all this great stuff going on in the US, so why not invest there? Why not set up operations? But last year alone, 17 states had declining year-over-year revenue. And so not everything is good in the market. The regulators are kind of dropping the ball. The regulations remain tight. The people aren't getting paid. There's a delinquent payment issue. And there's a lack of profitability. In fact, in a survey that I did mid-year last year, only 27% of the industry was profitable. Another 40% or so was breaking even, and a full third of the market, those operators were losing money. And so there's a lot of economic stress right now at the operator level and at the state revenue level. And so something has to be done, right? Something has to change. This is unsustainable. And also, because of the lack of profitability, groups are exiting the market. And so there was a decline of over 900 licenses nationwide from the year before. So, when there's 900 out of, say, 40,000, that's pretty significant. So the EU, on the other hand, despite the declining in revenue and all this stuff in the US in 17 states, that's like 42% of all of the states that have legal access, the EU is accelerating. There's the Germany market, Swiss market just recently announced. I was in France, I guess yesterday and the day before. There's some exciting prospects to expand the medical market there. And then Poland's doing some good stuff, Czechia. So there's a lot of opportunities if you choose them wisely. And then you've got Eastern and Southern Europe that could feed the supply into the rest of the markets, just kind of like Portugal's doing. And then you've got even Morocco is doing some work on reforming and converting their illicit growers into the legal market and then producing legal goods and shipping it to Europe. So I think the difference between the two markets is that the EU is taking a practical approach to this. It's slow as hell, but they're taking a practical approach to it, whereas the US is just run around like a head with your chicken cut off. So, but by comparison, the EU has roughly the same number of consumers, and so you've got this potential consumer market that's almost the same size in the number of consumers as the US, the EU as a whole. But there's some key differences, like I said. Now, in terms of supply, and I want to touch on supply over the next couple of slides. In terms of supply, on the low end, based upon that total addressable market, the UN data, you need about 7.8 million kilos or 17 million pounds to satisfy all of the legal and illicit demand. And if you, on the high end, that's about 46 million pounds, 21 million kilos. By comparison, the US is about a 50 million pound market. And so I think depending upon how these rollouts go, it's going to be, there's opportunities for cultivation in this space, just as long as you don't get too far out of balance between supply and demand. Now, if you compare that to the US, I mentioned that there's 50 million pounds of demand, illicit and legal. There's enough capacity. I just finished this analysis. This is kind of late breaking news. I haven't presented this except for last week. There's enough legal capacity in the legal states in the United States to satisfy 123 million pounds versus a market of 50 million pounds. So already the market is way over capacity, and that's not including the illicit suppliers out of California, Oregon, Tennessee, and other places. And so this is a major problem, and this is a major mistake that's done by state legislatures there. and the regulators. They can control this, and they're just not doing it. And the people that are suffering from this are not the consumers, because they have great prices now. The ones that are suffering are the operators and investors in this space. So whatever you do in Europe, don't do that. So in terms of Spain, there's a number of consumers, 3.3 million on the low end, 7.8 million on the high end. Now, there is a ton of tourists that come in for canna tourism in Spain, and so that supplements the demand. But just in general, Spain needs about 1.8 million pounds of output to satisfy the entire domestic market. That's not including exports. And so that's about 2,500 to 5,000 hectares, depending upon how efficient you are as a grower. And so I wanted to present this data because it's important to understand what the upper bound is, so that as an investor or operator, you understand where your limits are. Oh, and then Spain also has to address the illicit actors, the mafiosos and the like, the African supply chain. And with Morocco now looking to legitimize their cannabis industry there, that's a real serious threat to Spain and the Spanish market. Now, I wanted to look at a couple of trends in the EU. So there's these social clubs. I just got back from Amsterdam. I met the nephew of the founder of the Bulldog, arguably one of the early coffee shops, or if not the earliest. And they're celebrating 50 years of doing this. German clubs are the cultivation associations. They're hitting their stride. There was, 160 of them authorized. I'm not sure how many are in operation. And then you've got the Spanish clubs that have been around for decades, but just recently have they been hitting their stride over the last decade. Now, the Spanish officials are trying to shut these things down. But to me, does that really make economic sense? Probably not. So, and there's also this idea that tourism is bad in Barcelona, and there's been all these protests saying, tourists go home, don't come here. But when you look at it, there's about 6 to 12 million cannabis consumers, tourists that come to Spain every year. Barcelona with the clubs, they represent about 1/3 to 1/2 of that. Most of them have a fee, and they spend on products about $100 or 100 euros, excuse me. And so that represents like $1 billion market on the high end. And there's also a ripple effect that when you spend €1 in a community, then there's this ripple effect. It pays for wages, they pay for tapas, they go out and have other services and the like. So there's a multiplier effect that occurs when you spend money in an economy. And so the real economic impact of the social clubs is about €500 million to €1 billion just in Barcelona alone. And so why would you say tourists go home? I would welcome the tourists, and I would be more supportive from an economic perspective. I'd be more supportive of the social clubs, because that's driving a lot of tourism that may or may not occur. And so there's a gentleman that I wanted to give a shout out to, Brian Applegarth. He's in the US, and he and I have been teaming up on tourist numbers and looking at, I run the numbers, he looks at the opportunities. And so if you want more data on tourism and the like, even in other countries, we've got plenty of data on this, so just let me know. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about US investments. So there's been a decline in the number of investments made in terms of volume in the US, but there's been an increase in the dollar amount of those investments. So that means that of the ones that are getting the investment, they're getting more. And so, but there's just not as many of them, and a lot of this investment is through debt financing. People don't extend credit or don't want to purchase necessarily ownership in a company because it's too risky. They're instead getting debt payments and loans for their operations. But this is an eye chart, sorry about it, there's a lot of detail here, and this is from Viridian Capital Advisors. I've known Scott Graper for a decade now, or right around there, and so they put out some really good investment data on the US, and he's looking at the EU market as well. But the earnings, the profitability, all of this by these big companies is just not there. And so, like I mentioned earlier, investors are struggling, big businesses are struggling, small businesses are struggling in the United States. So when you look at the EU, you've got an emerging market, you've got accelerating reforms, and the US is not reforming at all. You've got an EU that's experiencing growth and has growth potential, albeit slow. The US is growing, but not in every market. And then you've got a pragmatic approach to cannabis reform, but the US is oversupplied, there's falling prices, compressed margins, and they're really restricting the access by the consumer through their policies. The dispensary model in the US is really a failed model, and they really need a reset in the US from a regulatory perspective. So if you had your choice, where would you invest? I'd probably, if just looking at an economic lens, I'd invest in Europe. But you're gonna need a fair amount of money, and that money is gonna have to last a long time because it's a slow process. It's gonna take a while for the market to really take off. So, the US is there. Now, I'm looking to hire people to analyze the European market. I want to have a dedicated resource here in Europe. And so if you have anybody that's looking for not a full-time job, but just a part-time job to do some research and funnel some data so that I can then give that data to you guys, just let me know, reach out, because I'm hiring. And so it's too important there needs to be more data on the European market. And so I'm willing to fill that void. I've done it very effectively in the United States, so I'm gonna do it here for Europe as well. So there's all sorts of opportunities, hemp, cultivation, even software, but it's not without risk. There's just less risk in the US, or there's less risk in Europe than there is in the US. So, and you just need to be disciplined in your approach. So my recommendations: education, partner, work with credible people if you can vet them, drive this certification. It's going to be the differentiation between who can enter the market and who cannot. Networking is really critical, so that's the importance of ICBC, the Tallman Group, and others. It's really important to network and develop those connections now, because you never know. And then use data, hopefully use my data. And then just realizing that cannabis is really emotional and it's a very local issue, right? And so you have to act local, but you have to keep the global marketplace in perspective, because at some point the reform's gonna take off, a lot of these markets will open up, and then you're competing against all these other countries. And so just remember, act local, think global. And so that's what I've got for you today. Thank you. I guess I should probably finish this off by saying muchas gracias, motherfuckers. But thanks a lot. Really appreciate it.
Beau Whitney. Thank you. Sorry. Beau Whitney. Do we have time for questions? What time is it? How come you don't know? We have 2 minutes. Who has a question? One? Okay, in the front. There you go. Thank you for bailing me out. I appreciate it. Oh, there you go.
Okay, so we're interested in buying a hemp company and a CPA practice also that is making at least $5 million a year of EBITDA. So given your knowledge of the world economics, what would you suggest we do?
So, so you're trying to invest $5 million, or you're
No, we're looking to buy a hemp business that is making $5 million a year of EBITDA. So they're already basically making $5 million of cash flow in 2024.
Yeah, so just looking at the hemp market, you've got just a total chaos in the US, and the chaos is because they're trying to differentiate between this 0.3% THC and everything else, and they're just getting confused, and it's just not working. And so as a result, it's created a lot of risk in the US market because all these states are trying to intervene and try to figure out how to address the cannabinoid market when they don't realize it's freaking everybody else out and it's impacting the fiber side and the grain side. But right now, because of the uncertainty and risk, it's driving people out of the industry, and the amount of acreage is going down in the United States that's licensed by the federal government. So at some point, a lot of the cannabinoid market, for example, was supported by all of this excess inventory that accumulated in 2019, 2020, and 2021. And so they're burning off that inventory now. And so I think that there's not enough licensed capacity on the hemp side to support the growth and continuation of the cannabinoid market in the US. So at some point, as a result of the lack of supply, I'm not saying now, but maybe in a year, maybe two, there's going to be opportunities because prices are going to go up. There's going to be more demand than supply. So the US might actually be a market to take a look at, but you're going to need to understand it a little bit better. There's going to need to be clarity from the farm bill that's currently being negotiated but also being postponed. So you've got a European market which is actually very supportive of the industrial hemp market. And so I'm not sure if you're looking at cannabinoids or other different products, but there's opportunity here. But the opportunities, it's kind of small scale right now. And so if there's opportunities where you could see growth in the European market, then I would go after that. There's a lot of efforts in Ukraine right now to rebuild Ukraine using hemp. There's a lot of opportunities on the cannabinoid side. And so I think there's opportunity there. And then also South America is starting to ramp up hemp just as much as they are on the cannabinoid side. And with South America, if you think about it, you could supply just up from South America into North America, and then you could stage that at a maquilador in Mexico, and then you could sell that CBD or what have you into the US market. So I didn't answer your question specifically, but I wanted to note that there's opportunities in the US within the next couple of years. It desperately needs infrastructural investment, desperately needs additional capacity. And then there's opportunities in Europe and in South America. Now, I'm putting together a forecast for the Federation of Industrial Hemp Organizations, or FIHO, and so I'm putting together a forecast of the total global market for hemp, and so I'll have much more clarity on that in a couple months than I have today. So thank you for the question, though.
Thank you very much. We're out of time now. Beau Whitney, one more time.